Okay, uh, hopefully everybody can hear and see me. Um, Let me maybe get a little feedback that I'm alive, that you can see and hear me from somebody, maybe on the chat message.
I can hear you, Andy. Yeah.
Perfect. There is Phil. Good. So welcome
Yeah.
everybody. Thank you all for joining us. You can't see outside, but I'm actually in the mountain kingdom of Telluride, Colorado. So I've warned people if my internet goes out, then others will take over. But I'm sure I'll get back in okay. This is our fourth webinar. Very excited about the increasing interest and the scope of our reach. And I think it's nice to just meet together even in this virtual way and enjoy some scholarship, but also some community and support at these times where we're not really meeting our colleagues in person. Today, as you know, we have Phillip Ayoub, who is presenting some work with Agnès Chetaille, and we'll be discussing, and they'll be discussing the LGBTQ movements in Poland, the history of activism, and talking a little bit, hopefully, about the current state of play in Poland and the presidential election, which is obviously focusing some of the minds on queer politics and homophobia and transphobia in that country. I should also remind you, and I'll remind you at the end, that we have next week two of the very few queer, young, Black, African-American State House members, Park Cannon and Vanetta Alston from North Carolina and Georgia will be in conversation about the state of play for LGBTQ people and African-Americans and people of color in politics in America today. Just a reminder that we will have our audio muted while the presentation goes on. If you'd like to ask a question, just let me know. I can put you on the list during the presentation. And without further ado, I'm very excited to hand it over for this fascinating discussion of Poland and activism to Phil, who will take us through a number of different elements of his work, but also talk about the current state of play. So over to you, Phil.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's really a pleasure getting to be part of your webinar, and I also want to thank you specifically for creating another space and platform for scholarship focusing on LGBTQ people. That's something I really appreciate and I'm very grateful for. Today I'm going to present a co-authored paper with my colleague Agnès Chetaille. Agnès, who's in the picture there in the corner on my slide, she unfortunately could not be here with us today, but I really just wanted to emphasize how much I enjoyed writing this paper with her. I'm really indebted to a lot of the great intellectual conversations we had. Agnès spent years doing deep ethnography in Poland, and I've not really met anyone yet that knows the Polish LGBTQ movement quite like she does in terms of the ins and outs and all the people in it and all the work that she's put into it as well over the years. So I really enjoyed working on this project with her. And I'm actually in Warsaw right now. And so after my presentation, which is going to be about 25 minutes, I have a little surprise that I get to, that I've set aside about 5 minutes to have my wonderful colleague and also friend Olga Brzezinska come and speak to us. She's sitting next to me right now. Speak to us on the contemporary Polish election. For some of you might know, it's a bit like the French system. I mean, the president doesn't have quite as much power as the French president, but it's a two-round system for the election. So in the first round, if no one gets over 50%, then it goes into a second round, which is on Sunday. And unfortunately, my talk is still a little bit relevant. It connects quite well to this because the election has, again, thematized LGBT people and so-called LGBT ideology quite extensively by the incumbent President Duda. And so it'll be great to have Olga speak to us briefly on that, and also be here for the Q&A, in part to give voice to local perspective, but also because she's really an expert in many of these things. That I'll introduce her properly when I'm done with the talk. The talk that I'm doing today on this paper, it's a presentation that looks at how social movement actors on the ground instrumentally shape and reshape their frames in light of new counter movements that emerge to challenge them. Methodologically, it's a little bit different than most of my work, given that Agnès and I were both doing our own large-scale projects, and we were kind of brought together in an intellectual collaboration. Some years later, we went back to our data and our interviews and tried to theorize a set of concepts related to this process. So it's a little bit more conceptual than analytical than most of my other work, but I can be happy to address some of this in a broader context in the Q&A as well. When Andy and I were talking about various papers I could present, this one really, because of the timing with the Polish elections, just seemed to have a lot of it made sense for this one to be the one that we would focus on today. So in the paper, we use the case of the Polish lesbian gay movement. We use that term consciously and not LGBT because most of the period under analysis from 1990 or 1987 to 2010 used that language in terms of how the movement described itself. So we look at the lesbian gay movement to explore how the movement's frames developed from embracing more universal master frames that you might be familiar with in your various contexts as well, like in the United States. And that was quite common in the 90s and early 2000s. But then in the mid 2000s, there was a shift to this interesting shift to a more rooted politics of being Polish, which is something you might recognize less if you study the LGBT movement. A lot of themes about nation, about Catholicism, came into the mix in this interesting dynamic that really puzzled and surprised us. And so we want to show how external discursive opportunities outside the state, so outside of the Polish state, shaped frames of both the movement and its opposition, but then we look at how they interacted with each other. So between 1987 and 2010, the movement, the paper uses that time frame to look at the movement's frames, and it makes the point that these framing processes are to a large extent derivative from the movement counter-movement interactions, as well as the multi-level context in which they operate. And I think that's interesting because it shows how an issue like LGBT rights can also develop in different ways depending on the context in which the movement operates. And I think it also has some currency for us in contemporary times, given that there are many countries that are dealing with this new waves of nationalist language, and movements have to respond to that. So just to give you some context before I kind of get into the theory, so entering the European Union in May 2004, it meant a kind of a specific political opportunity for the Polish lesbian and gay movement. They saw it as an opportunity to attain socio-political recognition for lesbian gay people. At the same time, their opposition also had a strong feeling about accession to the European Union, which came with a deep skepticism of what that accession might mean for Polish sovereignty. Combined also, and many conservatives were in favor of it, combined with seeing it as an opportunity for Poland to reintroduce Christian values to the European Union's political structure, to the European Union's polity. And this was partly philosophy for Pope John Paul II, who died in 2005, but so was still alive at the time. And he saw this as kind of an opportunity for an East to West evangelism of kind of to save the European Union. And in emphasizing that kind of goal, the lesbian gay movement was precisely the aspect of Europe that was to be rejected. And the opposition really focused on them in this narrative of, protecting the nation and improving Europe, or quote unquote, improving Europe. So while the Polish counter movement itself is a loose conglomeration of religious, political, and nationalist actors, their frames converged around this narrative of a nation being under attack by external forces, and this drive to protect the nation the negative parts of this outside influence. And I mean, this is really, really the lengths at which this argument were made were really surprising me, all the way making comparisons to kind of invasion by Protestant Germans during the Second World War. And I know not all Germans are Protestants, but that's kind of how it was framed, and Orthodox Russians in the post-World War II period. This really repeated narrative of the nation kind of under attack that needs protection from the outside. And LGBT people became part of that discourse in that time around European accession. And so that manifested itself in various ways. There were commonly bans on LGBT demonstrations. There were also some bills that fortunately didn't go through to remove school teachers who were LGBT from teaching children, etc. But they were really politicized in a period of an intense political homo and transphobia around 2005. And unfortunately, some of that carries on today. Some of you might have heard late last year in the news, there was this discourse around LGBT-free zones. And you can see the activist there on my slide with the purple hair is standing in front of the sign, entryway to a township, and underneath it there's a yellow sign that says, you know, this is an LGBT-free space. Also, in the Polish election that we are having, you know, this last month, President Duda again reverted back to the strategy of political homo and transphobia by singling out LGBT people. He attacked so-called LGBT ideology as the new Bolshevism, called it worse than communism, and referred to it as a foreign import that he needs to protect the Polish family from. So this is just to set the stage a bit about the various ideas in the mix in the Polish context that LGBT activists have to confront, and have had to confront over various periods of time. We all know from our own context that there's a lot of competing narratives on the table when it comes to LGBT politics, and Polish movements have had to navigate this, sometimes you know, in a way to produce certain kinds of political gains and successes, and sometimes though also just to sustain themselves and survive. So that's a little bit of the context which I'll be coming back to in a moment. But how do we go about that theoretically? I think for this audience, probably most of you are quite familiar with the scholarship in social movements that has written a lot about framing and how movements frame their demands in response to opposing movements. Yet, Agnès and I felt we still know too little about how movements navigate such a response, aligning new frames with old ones as interaction between opposing movements persists. So a frame, as it was originally defined in social movements, as an interpretive schema that simplifies and condenses the world out there by selectively punctuating and encoding objects, situations, events, and experiences and sequences of actions within one's present or past environments. Early articulations often conceptualized movement framing in a somewhat static environment. That said, movements we know must anticipate substantial flexibility in the way they frame their causes, especially in light of new challenges that come their way. And Robert Benford himself noted in his early Insiders critique that the meanings movements create are always negotiated, contested, modified, articulated, and re-articulated. At the heart of this notion is that meaning construction always occurs in a contested terrain. And with this in mind, Agnès and I used the contested terrain of Polish lesbian gay activism to make two theoretical interventions. One, to further conceptualize how movements strategize their claims given the emergence of new counter movements and new audiences. And two, to acknowledge that contemporary social justice movements operate in a multi-level environment. That means they might be drawing from frames at different levels, including at more international levels and at local ones. And this is a really core point for us, given that it's very hard to tease out the domestic from the international when it comes to LGBT movements, because the movements themselves have operated in such a transnational way for much, if not all, of their history. And they're constantly balancing domestic and transnational arenas. So this multi-level environment is important for this theory, and it suggests that movements can align their frames with universal tropes, many of the ones which I'm going to describe in a second that you might be familiar with. For example, framing that operates in multiple contexts that it could include framing around human rights, around democratic responsibilities. In Europe, it can include ones about European values or values associated with the European Union. But one such liability of such external frames is that they also introduce lesbian and gay people in a way that inadvertently also emphasizes their foreignness, making them an easy target for counter movements who politicize around morality politics in a way that calls them foreign elements that need to be rejected from the domestic space. So as we show in figure 1, when conflictualization occurs, and that's when the backlash to the movement emerged, it really reoriented the framing goals of the lesbian gay movement. It pulled them back down and rooted them into the nation, and a lot of their frames would shift to focusing on resonating with the identity attributes specific to the domestic space. And I'll talk about that a little bit, but we saw 2 trajectories, one where they start talking about LGBT rights, also in a more national or sometimes even religious language, but then also have a diversified set of frames where they create interesting new conglomerations between old and new. Sorry, and so I'm just showing you, I know there's a lot going on this slide, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview and then I'll explain each concept in turn. But this is kind of our mapping of the frames that we saw in this table, and in the 4 kind of in that row 2, where we introduce these concepts of alignment, which of course exists in literature, and then conflictualization, and then at the end, this framing strategy of mirroring and diversification. And at the beginning, there was alignment with various master frames operating outside of Poland. So a lot of, in the early period, a lot of nodding to human rights languages, universal principles of equality and rights, followed by a really democratic values language. This was especially around the time of Polish independence, when there was, in the 90s, these frames around returning to democracy, which the lesbian gay movement also used. And that was followed at the turn of the century with more educational frames and kind of respectability politics that talked about anti-discrimination, about anti-homophobia, about getting to know us. And then also a Europeanization set of frames, which talked about, adopting European values, or that sexuality and lesbian gay politics were part of European structures. And at the time, it was quite popular to join the European Union, so that was working, or that was seen as advantageous. After conflictualization occurs and the counter movement mobilizes a campaign and their own set of frames, we see this interesting dynamic of mirroring and diversification that involved, for example, reclaiming localness, turning to religion, to culture and memory, to indigenous queer histories, and then also a conglomeration, which were these creative new constellations of old frames and new ones, and sometimes reshaping old frames in a new way. So I'm going to go now through each of these concepts and try to explain them a little bit better. So by alignment, we refer to the abstract master frame that would have applicability in multiple contexts for movements that also operate transnationally or in other countries. So during the early period from 1987 to 2004, we see various examples of this kind of alignment. The 1990s activists used a common post-authoritarian return to democracy, a return to Europe, or return to normalcy frame. Those were common frames used also by other movements in Poland. A second important frame was the human rights frame, and all were connected to a identity building, constructing a positive identity, also circulating a newly formed Polish word gay, which is obviously an important translation, though spelled differently from the English gay, and deconstructing common myths and stereotypes around homosexuality. So that would be followed in the early 2000s by a new generation of lesbian gay activists that expanded on these themes. They worked to construct encompassing and non-contentious frames, and ones that did not single out any adversaries. And I think in the examples that I'm going to give now, you'll see how they're really not confrontational in this period. So at first there was the frames of homophobia and discrimination, which were focused on defining and calling out homophobia and discrimination in their description of the situation for Polish lesbian and gay people. And that's, I mean, there was one, I remember one interview with an activist I had where he mentioned that they did a flyer in the early 2000s for an event in Krakow, and that Microsoft Word in Polish corrected the word homophobia throughout the flyer, and they realized it later and had to reprint it. But it was this kind of idea that the word didn't exist in the vocabulary at the time. And this was something that was really inserted by the movement, including Poland's at the time new, but now most important LGBT activist organization. It's called the Campaign Against Homophobia. And you can see how they clearly position the organization as a promoter of educating about that term homophobia, which wasn't so existent in the political discourse. And the term was not selected for its local resonance, but for the potential legitimacy it offered in its foreign, namely Western origin. It associated the movement with the transnational successes these terms had granted the movement elsewhere, beginning in the 1990s, and it consciously avoided naming any adversaries. So this is where we get to the frame of challenging ignorance, ignorance being the main culprit for homophobia. So you could thus have homophobia without having homophobes, in the sense that it was just ignorance that was to blame. And the movements strategically emphasized avoiding against language, but welcomed emphasizing a language of four various resonant values of tolerance, equality, democracy, and love. So you had homophobia, and ignorance was why we had it, or that was at least the framing used. There were also an education framing. So there were two campaigns that were quite prominent in the early 2000s. Well, there are many, but two that I'll highlight here. One, and all of them kind of defined, again, homophobia, discrimination, and also sexual orientation. So the picture I have here is from the Let Them See Us campaign, which were billboards that were in various Polish cities and also a gallery, and then also a Get to Know Us campaign, which was supposed to display kind of who we are, provoking awareness of lesbian gay existence, as well as empathy and identification amongst the general public. And then there was another frame called the minoritizing frame, which was coming from, I'm not sure exactly the science behind this number, but the number was talked about a lot, was 5% of societies are homosexual. And so thus that led to some math of there being 2 million Polish gays and lesbians, which were then calculated to be the largest social minority in an otherwise rather homogenous country. So there was that minoritizing frame that was used as well. Another kind of alignment frame that came there was came with EU accession, again, which happened in 2004. And in the years before that, a lot of the movements used this kind of imagery you see here on the slide. And for those of you that are familiar with my other work, I write more about these kind of transnational networks that also brought in kind of foreign dignitaries from other states who all use this kind of EU language, that accepting lesbian and gay people came with the gamut of things you had to do to join Europe. And the protesters that would come also from other contexts usually wore t-shirts often wore t-shirts with the EU flag and some kind of language like Europa equals Tolerancja attached to it. So it was using that kind of enthusiasm about EU accession. Then around 2003 and 2004, following the Let Them See Us campaign and the Krakow March for Tolerance, the movement faced a really fierce and emerging opposition. In part, these opposition groups produced a rhetoric including strong references to morality, religion, and tradition, and an emphasis on defending the family and protecting children. In Poland, these tropes were always organized around the themes of nationalism, and also how national tradition, which equated Poles as Catholics, were in conflict with the claims and demands of the lesbian gay movement. And they really worked to challenge the lesbian gay movement's local authenticity, which ultimately then, this period of conflictualization shifted to changing their frames. And I actually included a picture here of Krzysztof Bozak, who was the head of the All Polish Youth, which was a really radical right, I think would be fair to call it a fascist youth organization that organized a lot of these demonstrations against lesbian gay activists. And the reason that I decided to mention him again now is because he was one of the presidential contenders. He didn't end up in the top 2, but he did get over 7% of the vote, which is really, I think, astounding for given his record. Also among many young people voted for him. So that was that's another connection to contemporary politics. The language that they used really harped on this kind of foreignness of lesbian and gay people and the lesbian gay movement. You can see this cartoon, which you see here on the right, which is being facetious, and it says, where you have those kind of ordinary looking people waving Polish flags, it says, so these are the fascists, or they are the fascists, and then compared to, and these are the Poles, you know, so it's being ironic. And under the, these are the Poles, you see a picture of people holding a rainbow flag, which is of course universally recognized symbol associated with the movement. It says gay is okay. And then you see the European Union flag, which connects to the kind of outside imposition things that they want to block. And then interestingly enough, there's also the Soviet Union's flag, which has, I mean, which is a little crazy given it's the Soviet Union is not really associated anyway with the lesbian gay movement, but it is put there because it is seen as another kind of thing, another kind of historical influence that we needed to defend the Polish nation from in this narrative. So they're all bundled together, and it's this weird construction of foreignness with the movement. And of course, this doesn't only happen in Poland. I have many other examples, other countries using this kind of dynamic, which you can see also here. So after conflictualization, movements had to respond, and they then shifted to framing a lot of their work as a struggle, not reclaiming as a struggle and reclaiming the memory of Polish political history and facing precise opponents, which they then did signal out. It wasn't just ignorance anymore. And so one of the concepts that we talk about there is this concept of mirroring, where we talk about how frames can come to mimic each other. And it's a process by which the movement sustains itself by adopting the symbols and imagery used by the opposition. So this is done strategically, often with irony, to give new meaning to the very symbols that were used to discredit them. So to challenge the constant accusation of foreignness, lesbian gay activists started to emphasize their Polishness in an attempt to reclaim national identity. And they use national symbols like the Polish flag, for example, that gradually started appearing more in marches, which again is somewhat unusual given how nationalism and its fixity has always really stood at odds with the fluidity of gender and sexuality. Then we also saw a diversification of frames, which is that we see a more diverse repertoire of frames within the domestic movement, one that now includes rooted and conflictual frames, and thinking through how this diversification is important because it limits the idea that counter-movement emergence coincides with the complete abandonment of all earlier frames, including the alignment frames. Instead, we really observe their coexistence with the more rooted and particular frames and how they're adapted. So for example, the homophobia frame was transformed over the years during the first period. Again, it was abstract and detached. So you could have, to the extent that you could almost speak of homophobia without homophobes. And then it was reinterpreted later after conflictualization occurred, where specific actors were signaled out as responsible for homophobia. And this is a quote from the Krakow March for Tolerance in 2006, where an activist explains the strategy of, at that march, using a Polish flag. So this is the beginning of the mirroring process, where using as a Polish flag at the beginning of the march as an important to show people that we too are Polish. And then she continued to say, in fact, it is really strange to see the Polish flag covered in eggs, because people who love or who are supposed to love Poland threw eggs at the Polish flag. And this is something to show the public that the flag was vandalized not by us, but by the quote unquote other side. And so we see this also, you know, after the period of analysis. So these images are more recent, following 2010, but we see various kind of rooting frames still persist. So the Campaign Against Homophobia changed their logo to what you see there, which is actually the borders of the Polish nation, which, I mean, this might just be my interpretation, but it also seems like a rooting kind of strategy. And then there was also this campaign rolled out in 2016, which was said, let us offer each other a sign of peace, which was resonant locally in part because it was kind of giving an olive branch to Catholics to say that there should be some kind of reconciliation. It's also what you say to people, what Catholics say to each other at Mass. But also an activist behind the campaign told me that it was also resonant because in 1965, Polish bishops sent a letter to German bishops 20 years after the end of the Second World War to kind of say, all right, let's move forward, show each other these kind of interesting ways of how this is brokered. And actually one of the conference I was at where this campaign was discussed by Polish activists was called Reclaiming Family Values, which shows that this is not just a Polish phenomena that, which, I mean, the idea of reclaiming family values doesn't really sound like an LGBT movement goal, but it is a language that many movements are talking about right now in order to respond to the counter movement charge, which has become more and more global as well, that it has diffused across many countries. So I'm going to wrap up. I just wanted to say that, you know, this talk has hoped to trace, you know, instrumental framing around morality politics in the Polish lesbian and gay movement. And I think one of our goals was to say that in these kind of movements, they don't function in a static environment, and also not just at one level of discourse, and that scholars really need to pay attention to persistent and changing interactions, both within movements and counter movements at the domestic level, but also how they interact with movements at the international level. And I hope that it's a bit interesting reflection for these times where frames rooted in nationalism are diffusing and being used in multiple contexts. And I hope it's also a reflection against applying the same models, often used models coming from states with quite a bit of cultural hegemony, without the folks on the ground in the receiving context who know how to root them locally, which I think is really important for movements as they navigate these really intense environments. So I'm going to stop now, but I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Olga Brzezinska. Olga is a long-term academic lecturer in European Studies and Cultural Management at the Jagiellonian University. That's the oldest university in Poland, in Krakow. And she is also program director of the Miłosz Festival, president of the City of Literature Foundation. She's also part of the Krakow Mayor's Equality Council, and importantly, she's the former head of office for Anna Grodzka, Poland's first trans parliamentarian. And I know, especially with the crew that is doing the fantastic work with Andy here on looking at representation, you know, Anna Grodzka's election was a very important for representation for the Polish LGBT movement. And so I thought it was really neat that we get to have Olga join us for a moment today to talk about contemporary politics. And I'm going to let her join us here.
Hello, thank you, Phillip, for in recent years, both politically and socially, especially after the developments it has made recovering from the communist rule in the last 3 decades. After 1989, Poland has returned to the world's democratic community by joining NATO in 1997, by joining the European Union in 2004, electing the first openly gay MP, Robert Biedroń, and first transgender MP, Anna Grodzka, in 2011. Anna Grodzka, whom I served as head of parliamentary office in Krakow, as Phil has said. Fast forward to 2020, Poland ranked as the worst country in the European Union for LGBT people, according to the annual Rainbow Map produced by ILGA Europe, a Brussels-based NGO that advocates for the rights of LGBT people. The ranking takes into account not only the legal situation for LGBT people, but also the social climate they face. Poland was ranked second worst in last year's ranking, but now has fallen past Latvia into bottom place following 5 years in which the Polish ruling party, Law and Justice, and the Catholic Church led a vocal anti-LGBT campaign, which has only intensified during the presidential campaign now. The leader of the ruling party, Jarosław Kaczyński, declared that Poland must defend children and normal families from the alien LGBT ideology, which he claims threatens the identity, the nation, and the Polish state in general. The Archbishop of Krakow called LGBT people a rainbow plague and likened it to Bolshevism and Nazism. Nearly 100 local governments in Poland have pledged to protect traditional family values and declared themselves free from LGBT ideology. A conservative newspaper distributed LGBT-free zone stickers, and one province governor awarded medals to citizens who opposed LGBT ideology. People are getting verbally harassed and physically attacked in Poland as a result of the vile anti-LGBT hate speech spouted by the Polish president and his party here during the election campaign. This past week, a group of colorfully dressed people standing in front of a gay club in Krakow were attacked by 2 men with clubs. These are just a few examples of how dehumanizing, stigmatizing, and demonizing LGBT people in the media and in everyday politics influence the society and the general social climate. Poland's incumbent president, Andrzej Duda, comfortably topped the first round of the presidential election on June 28th, but was pushed into a runoff with his liberal challenger, Rafał Trzaskowski, the current mayor of Warsaw. A few months ago, defeating Duda seemed impossible. It looked impossible because Trzaskowski was not even on the ballot until the election was postponed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But his electoral chances have improved greatly since he took over after the original candidate, Małgorzata Kidawa-Błońska, stood down. Numerous polls suggest that the race is too close to call. On the last stretch, the most important seems mobilization of the electorate, pro-turnout campaigns, and the support of the other candidates that featured in the first round. The presidential runoff on Sunday will determine the path the country will follow in the future. And if Poland's president Duda wins, the Law and Justice Party will be able to continue to rule almost unchecked. Their nationalist agenda over the past 5 years has put Poland on a collision course with the EU and led the country to be downgraded to a partially consolidated democracy by the Freedom House. When Duda goes up against his liberal challenger, there will be more at stake than just the medium-term policy trajectory for the country. To a large extent, it is a choice between openness and backwardness, tolerance and exclusion, between thoroughly European thinking and national egoism, parochiality, and xenophobia. It's a choice between civil society and its enemies. The result will also resonate well beyond Poland's borders. To complete the picture that I have painted, I need to emphasize that there have been some positive developments in Poland with regard to LGBT people, including a record of 24 Pride marches last year, and the fact that courts overturned a lot of attempts to ban marches in a number of cities. Opinion polls also indicate that a growing majority of the public support introduction of the right to same-sex civil partnerships, with a figure reaching 60% last year. Even the current president, Duda, has indicated that he would be willing to sign such legislation into law. Poland is an utterly divided country. As the polls undoubtedly show in these elections, and as was corroborated by the first round of the presidential elections. This division, however, is not unique to the country. It is mirrored in a myriad of ways around the world and is always based on prejudice. Reporting on the Polish presidential election abroad has largely focused on the president's use of hate speech, condemning LGBT people. This loathsome rhetoric should be exposed to harsh light, and I hope it shrivels and dies. There will be a head-to-head between Duda and Trzaskowski this coming Sunday. I hope, and let us all hope, that despite the conspicuous polarization, Polish people will choose wisely to prove that they are better, more progressive, and more inclusive than politics in the country. I will gladly answer any and all questions that may come up, but thank you for letting me give you a few thoughts on the current situation in Poland.
Well, thank you, Olga, and we really appreciate you joining us as well. And thank you, Phil, for your presentation and inviting Olga to join us. I'm sure all of us see your courage and bravery working in Poland, and we appreciate it and we respect what fabulous sterling work you've been doing. So thank you for that. We have a nice long line of questions, and I'm sure other people will jump in as well. Let's start with Scott Siegel.
Okay, first of all, Philip, I want you to know that Andy didn't have a chance to take my question last week, so he chose me to go first. So this is no element of favoritism or anything here. And just so you know, in the background, my daughter is here watching on her iPad, so hopefully she won't be interrupting the question I have. But basically, I wanted to ask more about framing for both of you. Is that it sounds very cynical to me what framing does. It seems that the movements are always asking or questioning, is this working to advance our cause? Is this working to advance our cause? Without really sort of considering maybe the values of the people articulating those frames are changing. And what I mean more specifically is that maybe it is the case that even the advocates for LGBT rights, and Olga can talk about this, whether it's true or not, are actually changing their values as well and becoming more nationalist as well. That we see a pattern, of course, in the United States and in Western Europe of the so-called homocons, or the people who are homo-nationalists and so forth. And so I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit more about what exactly frames do, and is it more than just this strategic way of advancing a cause, or is it actually the people who people are changing their attitudes and values, or are there even different people articulating these values over time? Thanks.
Sure. Should I go first?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Scott. That's a really great question. And we really focus in the paper specifically on instrumental framing. So I think we're also kind of pulling out the more instrumental parts, but I think it's a really important question. I think a lot of what we were charting, Agnès and I, was dealing with instrumental framing, in part because the activist communities, in the conversations about these strategies, they were really hard on them too. The last image I showed of the church campaign, I observed also quite a bit of kind of intense debate about, is it really okay to reconcile with the Catholic Church given all of the trauma, and it wasn't with the Catholic Church specifically, but with Catholics in general. Is that a strategy that, the movement could really get behind? And then in those cases, a lot of it was spoken about in a kind of strategic and instrumental way. It's not to say that there wasn't belief amongst many activists that these were a good course, but they were really quite debated. And some of the activists, there's fractures around a lot of these strategies as well between activist communities that emerged when it shifted into this kind of mirroring process. So I think, unfortunately, much of it was also instrumental. That what you're saying, though, is 100% right. It is the acknowledgement also that sometimes outside of activist communities, there is a nod to shifting preferences and changes in the gay and lesbian community as well, and coming to reflect that, and the kind of conservatism that you speak of in the movement is something that I think we see here as well. But it was really, I think the instrumental part is moments where there's recognition. It's not just about collective identity building within the community, but that they have to take into account the broader environment and including non-gay and lesbian people that they have to appeal to in a certain ways in certain moments, and when is the right time to do that without losing the essence and heart of what the movement stood for in different times.
Mhm. Thank you for this question, Scott. I've heard it many times, but I also think that I would prefer the choice of the word tactic or strategic rather than cynical. And I don't think that when it comes to the Polish LGBT movement, it is a cynical choice of the language and strategies. It's rather instrumental or tactic, because it needs to be taken into account that the Polish society is largely conservative. So in order to seek allies, they need to choose their strategies wisely. And also, when you look at the history of the Polish LGBT movement, you can see the progressive professionalization. So this is also something that informed the choices of strategies.
Great. Let's take a question from Dmitry Tokachev.
Hi from Russia. Thank you for your presentation. My question, how movement frames stand against heteroactivist or homophobic frames, how effective they are, because as we can see, these frames are not so effective. And if I, for example, compare the situation with Russian situation, we have three main frames of Russian citizens. Some of Russian citizens think that homosexuality is disease. Others think that this is deviation, and some of Russians think that this is sexual orientation. So maybe the probably problem here that these frames not work well with or against heteroactivist or homophobic frames.
Mm-hmm. That's a fantastic question. Thank you, Dmitry. I'm not sure if it's really hard to talk about, the success of frames of producing some kind of desired result with opinion change. We have seen opinion change move quite positively in Poland until about 10 years ago, that when it flattened, and depending on the poll, it really, sometimes it looks like it's going up a little bit, sometimes it's going down. It also depends on the question, whether it's on partnership or adoption. So we see a lot of variation. But if we look at from the 1990 period or the 2000 period to now, we do see that the movement has made inroads in speaking to society at large, because there is a sizable shift in the way LGBT rights and politics are talked about that didn't exist before. So I think something is working, but I really also want to emphasize that in this particular paper, we weren't analyzing as much, are the frames leading to success? It was sometimes really talked about as a way to sustain the movement, to be able to engage and move past the interaction with a really intense opposition, and to basically try to, in the mirroring process, also try to give new meaning to what they were charged with. So, for example, uncovering local indigenous queer histories to challenge the idea that this was a foreign import. So I hope that's a partial question. I'm sure you have much more knowledge on this as working in the Russian context, where I think the kind of foreign agent or foreign imposition argument is quite similar there. But those would be my brief reflections.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
One of the exciting things about this is we started with a question from America, and then Russia, and now from Namibia. We're really going around the world. So Pancho Mologeni.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so glad for this presentation. My question is, when you look at the data, it seems all over Eastern Europe, there's such poor acceptance of LGBT people. And my birth country, Bulgaria, on my mother's side, even worse, according to this Pew Research Center. And one of the things that my mom keeps on telling me is that the CIA is actually responsible. And she would actually tell me, the CIA has ruined you. They've made you so radical. So this idea of foreign interference, it's really there. And I just want to ask, what do you think is the way out? Because one way that I see is that we are constantly having people like Pew Research Center, Gallup, survey, Global North, and Eastern European countries and tell us how bad it is. And I'm so glad that you brought Olga, you know, to actually speak on behalf of the people there. So maybe we should empower more of these people in Global South to speak for themselves as a framing of itself, as opposed to having, you know, people in the Global North survey us and then tell us the same thing each and every time. It's terrible, you know. That's just my question, but I guess it's also a comment. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Pancho. Do you want to go?
No, go.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, it is really surprising with the currency with which this kind of ideas around the foreignness of LGBT rights circulate. And I think in terms of how it can be responded to or challenged, which was the first part of your question, I think, well, I mean, I am inspired by the Polish movement, which I think has become, you know, despite the context that Olga addressed, you know, is one of the most important movements in Europe in general in terms of what it has accomplished and kind of its innovative campaigns and the people it has turned out. So I think part of what they've done in, you know, with irony, using some of the language of the opposition has been one way to do that. It comes with certain costs, of course, and like the answer to Scott's question, intense debate. But I also think it's a really tough context. And what I didn't talk about in this talk is also the way that counter movements challenge LGBT movements at a global level. And we see more of that, especially in the last decade, where there's, you know, with the support of powerful states and the support of powerful international organizations, including the World Congress for Families and others, there are groups that are mobilizing at the UN, at the Council of Europe, in different international fora that really use this same language and also try to diffuse certain kinds of policies around protecting religious liberty or protecting, you know, from XYZ issues that the LGBT movement wants. And so I think it's a formidable challenge for movements to coordinate around. And I think the Polish example is an interesting one to study that has currency for elsewhere, including, I hope, in the Global South. Yeah.
And I would also add that international context for the Polish LGBT movement has been of utmost importance, especially in times of political turmoil, especially in between 2005, 2007. That was the first period the Law and Justice Party ruled in the country, and then since 2015 when they took over again, because this is the time specifically when the LGBT NGOs and the whole movement are deprived of the money and the support. So without the international context, without international organizations, or the support of or the support from abroad, the movement would have difficulties operating.
Wonderful. Let us move to Ari Shaw.
Hi, Phil and Olga. Thank you both so much for the fantastic presentation. I am sort of curious about the local interaction with not only transnational frames, but frames that may be used in other national contexts, and wondering whether you observed any learning or adaptation by Polish lesbian and gay activists from frames used by activists in other states who responded to counter movements, even outside of Europe, or whether the rootedness of counter movement frames really demanded a sort of uniquely national mirroring or national response.
Thank you, Ari. Could you say the last part again? I'm sorry, it just cut out for a second.
Oh, sorry. Just whether you saw Polish lesbian and gay activists learning from or adapting national level responses by activists in other countries, even outside of Europe, or whether the sort of uniquely rooted frames used by the counter movement kind of required its own sort of uniquely.
Oh yeah. That's a fantastic question. Absolutely, we see that, you know, so there is a constant also reflexive learning between the movement at different levels. So a lot of the alignment frames, which were coming sometimes from experiences in other countries, they worked to some degree and didn't work to others. And also activists on the ground are also choosing which to pull down, which tactics to use. But that said, they also feed back to other contexts. So for example, I mentioned the example of being at this Reclaiming Family Values activist meeting, where then a lot of times the Polish activists were also, teaching their strategies they were developing, and they were being implemented in other contexts. So you had other countries from different parts of the world wanting to hear about the let us show each other a sign of peace kind of tactics. So there's constant adaptation and learning, and I think that and Pancho got at this a little bit in his talk, that there are certain tactics in certain countries that play a larger role because of the hegemony and the resources, etc., behind their activism. If I saw a funding distribution between global north and global south, and actually Europe was quite poor as well, but North America has such a chunk of the pie when it comes to funding for these activists. So of course they have an outsized input, but I do think that a lot of these innovative groups on the ground are also feeding back to other levels and saying, no, this didn't work here and we need to think about it differently, or the times have changed and we have to adapt. And it is my hope that scholars and activists really listen to that as well and are willing to be flexible.
Great, thanks.
All right, let's squeeze in a couple more questions. We have Sam Ritzholtz.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. And thank you, everyone, for such interesting comments, and to the two presenters for the interesting presentation. My question actually follows up rather nicely after Ari's, and I think you were both getting at this in the presentation, but I'm just interested, when we talk about these frames, the frames are being presented as chronological, as this change in how the movement itself is arguing and positioning itself. And I was just wondering, for both Phillip and Olga, if there was any thought about the differences in the frames as almost inflection points, as moving from one narrative to another, and if you have calling them inflection points, have you either analytically or theoretically tried to work through what caused these inflection points and whether there can be any type of insight drawn from those moments? It seems that as presented, that a lot of these inflection points were exogenous or coming from outside sources. And so I'm just wondering if there was both a cultural movement that these movements were responding to, as well as a political one, or whether it was internal, and if there's any type of perhaps similarity between whether there's 3 or 4 of these inflection points. Thanks.
That's great.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that one of them obviously is the political climate, because we use different rhetoric and different narratives in 2011, 9 years ago, when we had an openly gay MP and the first transgender MP in the parliament. So the narrative around LGBT issues was completely different in the media and among politicians. And now we went backwards. So in terms of the constant progression, we can't say that this is a development that is linear. Now we went backwards a lot. So there is a fruitful ground for scholars to analyze frames, how they come back, how they go away.
Yeah, I'll just add very quickly, since I know we're short on time, but Sam, yeah, it's a fantastic comment and thought, and we did try to theorize it with the diversification frame, and in the paper, I'll try to circulate the paper if I can. That does deal with that it's not this chronological step, that it is pulling and adapting all the time. We did, of course, and I remember Agnès and I had a lot of interesting conversations about trying to put it into a theoretical model, because it was really tough to kind of follow when this happens, but we were able to temporally, kind of like Tina Fettner's work, to show that there were certain critical junctures, which is what we call the conflictualizations, when things change in a certain way. But you're right, there was a lot of other adaptation that in my simplification in 20 minutes is missing some of those points that you highlighted. Thank you for that.
Great. Let's take penultimate question from Ken Sherrill. Oh, Ken, can you hear me? Ken, your speaker's not working for us. Yeah, Not coming through.
Ken, we can't hear your,
No.
there's something with the audio that's not working, unfortunately, Ken.
Yeah. No, still not working. I tell you what, why don't you type your question to me, and then we'll take Anthony Castell, and then I'll come back to you. But type your question to me, Ken.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Yep, we can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for your fascinating research and illuminating talk. That was very interesting. Thank you. I just have a quick question. Could you say a few words on the way LGBT free zones operate and how they came into being, how they function, and how they impact the citizenship of LGBTQ people over there?
That's just a proclamation. It's just the local governments that declared their provinces LGBT-free zones, and that there is no legal base for that, and that there's nothing that is officially or legally banned. What they mean is no LGBT rights promotion can happen in these zones. So basically, this is just a declaration. We don't support, and we also don't, and we also ban LGBT rights promotion. So this is it. There is no legal basis for that. This is just media news, you know, and that just means that there is a permissive consensus over the province or in the local government that they support conservative, traditional vision of life, of collective identity, of families, and so on. So this is how this operates. It's the only visible sign of LGBT-free zones is that they attached post signs in the roads leading to the cities or to the towns which declared themselves LGBT-free zones. That's it. So how this, there was also a second part of your question, how this affects the community. A lot of people are leaving towns and moving to bigger cities because they're scared.
Interesting. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm gonna give Ken a couple more minutes to type his question. Just to kill for time, I have a question about, to both Olga and Phil. Obviously there was a little bit of preliminary success in the representation of gay and trans people in politics in Poland. In the current climate, are there still a sort of a bench of activists who are interested in getting involved in electoral politics at the local and even the national level? I know Robert Biedroń was running for the presidency, and that was a very symbolic moment as well. But to what extent do Polish LGBTQ activists see electoral politics still as a place to try and insert their voice?
Well, Robert, I think, hit the momentum in 2011 when he became the MP, and then he was running for different posts. He became mayor of Słupsk. He won the elections to the European Parliament and became an MEP. And in this presidential election, he was one of the 11 candidates that featured in the first round, but he finished disastrously with only 2.2% of the total support. So this is also indicative of the climate surrounding LGBT people or openly gay people in politics. But this is coupled with the general climate surrounding the left-wing parties or movements, for that matter.
Yeah, exactly. You know, at the time I was there at the election party of Ruch Palikota, is what the party was called at the time, when they were a brand new party. They won 10% of the vote, I think, in 2011. Yeah, 11. And they on their party list, that is how Robert Biedroń and Anna Grodzka became parliamentarians, and it really had a pro-Europe kind of anti-clerical, a lot of feminist LGBT goals in the party platform, and there seemed to be more of a momentum for left parties and left politics than now. But correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't seem to be as visible, even though there have been important gains, and we should really also talk about those, steps. So there was a gender recognition bill was passed by the parliament. It was vetoed by the incumbent president, who's now up for re-election. The parliament became very close to passing the kind of partnership bill that Olga mentioned before, that there is actually support for in the Polish public. The movement is strong. It just has shifted to a more divisive and kind of polarized discourse, unfortunately, with a large position of power for the Law and Justice Party that has signaled out LGBT people consistently in its politics.
Fabulous. Okay, so we're a few minutes over time, but thank you, everybody. I'm going to pass on Ken's question and other questions I get for you. And we really appreciate both Olga and Phillip for presenting to us today. Thank you all for spending your hour today. And I should remind you that next week we have two fascinating state legislatures in the US, Vanetta Alston from Durham, North Carolina, Park Cannon from Atlanta, Georgia. Both are African-American women who identify as queer and are making great waves within their own state houses in obviously difficult environments. So thank you all again for joining us. We will, I think, continue this through the fall. We have a lot of people who've presented fascinating abstracts who would like to present in the fall. So please share this, the registration for the Queer Politics webinar with your friends and colleagues and anybody else you think will be interested. Right now we have about 260 people on our list. We had 70 people at our height today, 72 people at our height today, which I think for any seminar on queer politics is pretty good. I love the diversity from Russia to the States to Poland to Namibia. If you haven't visited, Namibia is like the Santa Cruz of Africa. It's a place you have to go. So thank you all. Keep well, keep safe, and we'll see you next week with the two North Carolina, Georgia legislators. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.